Hello, everyone. Welcome to a brand new episode of Debunked Files. I've already seen so many of you commenting and watching. That's awesome. Please continue to ask questions and chat with us in the chat box. We'd love to hear feedback from you guys. It's going to be great because not only are we going to have this episode with Dr. Stephen Meyer, but we're also going to have a part 2 in a few weeks. So we hope you join us tonight for the entire time and join us in a couple weeks also. But of course, I have to introduce Mr. Bub Coons. Bub, how's it going?
I'm doing well. I'm in an undisclosed place somewhere in California. So my background, everything's different, but I couldn't miss this. I'm super excited to have my friend and brilliant scholar and Christian, because we got a question right before this whole thing started. Is Stephen a believer? And he is, but I'll have him talk about that. You know, one thing I want to say about this man is not that it's just his mind is brilliant, but he's got an amazing giving heart. I mean, proof of that is he was just on the Joe Rogan show for 3.5 hours, and he answered some brilliant questions. One of my favorite ones when he talked about the resurrection. And that is a huge, probably the biggest podcast in the world. And yet he has the time and the humility to come on our little show as we're just launching stuff. So I want to just say thank you and say, Stephen, it's really good to see you, my friend. It's good to see you. And thank you for being on our humble little show. Appreciate it.
I love your backgrounds. It looks pretty cool. So yeah, I'm glad to be on. And thank you for the kind introduction.
You bet. You know, I want to get right into some questions, but just for our audience sake, and just give us a little bit of background on your education. And then I'm just going to jump in and my angle here is really going to just kind of be a lot more simple than some of the stuff that you deal with a lot. I just want to get back to the basics of what evolution is and stuff. But for now, give us a little bit of your background.
Sure. I did a double major in college in physics and geology, earth science, with a minor in philosophy. And I think I actually minored in math, too. So I geeked out a little bit in college, but had some time to play baseball and a few other things. So it was a great experience. And then I worked in the oil industry as an exploration geophysicist for 4 years. I was doing seismic digital signal processing. And after 4 years, I received a scholarship from the good people at Rotary International to study in England. And I was accepted into a program in the history and philosophy of science in Cambridge, England, where I ended up doing a master's degree in history and philosophy of science, and then a PhD on the topic of origin of life biology within that same department of the history and philosophy of science. So it was sort of an interdisciplinary study of all the issues that arise in the origin around the question of how life first arose from the supposed prebiotic soup of simpler chemicals, something like that. The whole theory, I've examined the whole theory of chemical evolution. And following that, I taught for 12 years at Whitworth University in Washington State. Halfway through that time, I co-founded the Center for Science and Culture with my colleague John West at Discovery Institute. And for the last 21 years, I've been at Discovery full-time. I resigned my teaching position after 12 years at Whitworth. So that's a little sketch of my journey.
Well, so you're not qualified at all to answer some of these questions then. Yeah. Okay. So the basics.
Hey, so Bub, do we want to play the debunked video first, just to get?
Oh yeah, we have one on this subject.
We have one on evolution. So should we play
that?
Yeah.
Let's have some fun. Let's see what Stephen thinks about that. Play it away.
Awesome. Let's go.
Matter to man, protein to purpose, accident to president, and poo-poo to pawpaw. Welcome to the evolution revolution, my Stardust siblings. It's all the rage, you know. Profs at prestigious universities, top-notch high school teachers, and all kinds of scientists the world over insist that evolution is a bona fide fact. But is it? Well, we're going to gander at the biggie and take it on mano a mano. How, you ask? With math. But before I jump into my speedy soliloquy, when I say evolution, I'm talking about mindless and undirected forces arranging already existing atoms over lots of time, eventually and ultimately producing all the life we see around us. Now, back to math, and a little bit of chemistry. But don't worry, you don't need to know much to knock down this fallaciously feeble, finicky, and faulty Frankensteinian fable foisted fervently from fanciful figures framing fakery for Faustian fame. No, 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 no. And here we go. This is a protein, the basic building block of life. A protein is made up of a chain of amino acids that bond together in a specific sequence. When it comes to living things, though, not just any amino acid will do, and not just any sequence will work. First, of the roughly 300 amino acids we know of, only about 20 are useful for life. Second, these amino acids must be arranged in a very rare sequence to form the right kind of protein useful to build a living cell. So, you got the basics, let's do the math. What are the odds that an undirected, mindless process like evolution could produce just one single protein molecule fit for life? Let's keep it simple. The size of a protein with a stable structure called a fold ranges between about 75 and 30,000 amino acids. Let's just take a small number like 150. Fair enough? Great. So, if each amino acid in the chain of 150 has roughly 20 possible variations, that would mean a life-permitting protein forming by chance would be 20 to the 150th. Now you reduce that down, pass it around, you get 10 to the 195th on the wall. That's a 1 with 195 zeros after it, just in case you didn't know. But there are other rare sequences that can work, and we would have to factor that into the equation, but I'll be honest, I just don't want to do that. Thankfully, Doug Axe, a molecular biologist, has, and he found that the odds of a relatively short protein to properly function are less than 1 in 10 to the 77th, which is true for a large number of proteins. So that's a 1 with 77 zeros. Now you throw the peptide and the left-handed amino acid problems in there, you get something close to 10 to the 164th. Now, keep in mind that scientists define the occurrence of anything with less than 1 in 10 to the 50th as absurd. But we're way beyond absurd here. Allow me to paint a visual. It would be like traveling the universe in an accidentally manufactured spacecraft, stopping on a whim, then reaching out blindfolded into a sea of 10 to the 80th different colored atoms and retrieving the only red one. All this, mind you, just to get one protein, and you need roughly 300 to form the simplest living cell we know of. But the point is this: can't get a protein, you can't get a cell, and you can't get a life. That's just, well, life, so deal with it. But at least be honest with me, you wouldn't bet on the next hand after your opponent dealt himself a royal flush, would you? And that's far more likely to happen than our protein problem. So please, don't bet something more precious on an absurdity. And that's all I got for now, but rest assured, this chucklesome notion that blind, undirected processes can produce even a single protein, let alone life, has been, dare I say, mathematically anyway, debunked. Adios.
Oh, there you go. There's our little humble approach. You know, you can't cover everything in 5 minutes, so you got to throw a bunch of other stuff in it.
That's pretty amazing what you covered, though.
Thanks. Just what I wanted you to see that. I don't know if you've seen that before. You actually helped me with that a long time ago. I don't know if you remember that, but I called you and you told me about the fold, and that was really good information to help. So thanks for that. So backing up a little bit to that video, and I know we touched on more. There's a guy that wrote and said this is more about abiogenesis and not evolution, and that's pretty true. But the point was, you have no life, then nothing can evolve. So anyway, what is evolution? What is it in a nutshell?
Sure, we'll start there, and then we'll come back to your friend's objection, because there's more to say about that.
Okay.
Evolution the term evolution has many meanings, and that's where a lot of the confusion comes, and where some of the mischief comes. Evolution can mean, first of all, simply change over time. And that can refer to the fact that life on the planet today is different than it was in different periods of geological history. We don't have trilobites or dinosaurs on the planet today, and we did a long time ago. So life has changed over time. It can also refer to what biologists sometimes call a small-scale microevolutionary change. And good examples of that might be things like the Galapagos finches and the beaks that they have changing in response to varying weather patterns, or the famous peppered moths in the industrial Midlands of England changing coloration in response to varying levels of pollution. So the first meaning of evolution is change over time, and really no one really doubts that.
Right.
No one doubts the microevolutionary variations that occur within the context of a given gene pool. Or no one really doubts that life is different now than it was a long time ago in the fossil record, as recorded in the fossil record. Second meaning of evolution is the idea that all of the change that we have seen over the history of life, or that has occurred over the history of life, has been completely continuous, such that the best way of depicting the history of life is as a great branching tree, where the branches at the top of the tree represent all the forms of life we have today, and the trunk or the root of the tree represents that first one-celled organism from which everything else allegedly morphed and changed and evolved into all the forms we see today. In other words, the second meaning of evolution is a picture of biological history, and a picture that depicts that history as one involving continuous change from one or very few simple forms at the very beginning of life, branching out into all the forms we have today. The third meaning of evolution is the idea that there is an unguided, undirected process, typically affirmed as natural selection acting on random mutations and other variations, and that unguided, undirected process of natural selection acting on random mutations has produced all the change that is depicted by the tree of life picture of the history of life. So, or another way to say it is, it has produced all the forms of life we see on the planet today. And that unguided, undirected process is thought to be unguided and undirected because it was invoked by Darwin and by Darwinists subsequent to Darwin as an explanation for something that all biologists recognize, and that is that life looks as though it were designed, looks as though it had been designed for a purpose. That is the idea of apparent design. Richard Dawkins, one of the most famous contemporary Darwinists in the world, has said that biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. And the key word in that quotation is, of course, appearance. For the Darwinians and the modern neo-Darwinians, the appearance of design is an illusion. Living systems, in their view, look as though they were designed for a purpose, but they weren't really designed because there is this unguided, undirected mechanism, namely natural selection, acting on random variations and mutations that produces the appearance of design without that mechanism being guided or designed in any way, and therefore the appearance of design is just an appearance. Because there's no actual intelligence involved in the process, there's no evidence of actual design, only systems that bear the appearance of design, but that appearance again is an illusion. So those are the three main definitions: change over time, universal common ancestry, and the idea of an unguided, undirected mechanism, chiefly the mechanism of natural selection acting on random mutations and variations.
And like you said, very, very few people have a problem with that first. We all know things change. So that's not what we're really talking about when we hear
Change
that
over
word.
time is trivial and not a contentious proposition.
Right. So what convinced you along the way? Maybe you were convinced earlier, I don't know, but that something was wrong with that it didn't add up. What was a convincing factor for you? Or
well,
many?
To complicate the science lesson just a bit further, what I've just described are the three elements in the theory of biological evolution. If we want to explain, and that is to say, there are two branches of evolutionary theory. There's evolutionary theories about how new forms of life arose from simpler pre-existing forms. That's what we've just been talking about. And that theory involves all three of those elements: the idea that there's change over time, but secondly, that the change has been continuous, so that the history of life is best depicted as a great branching tree. And then thirdly, the idea that there is an undirected, unguided, materialistic mechanism that is capable of producing all the change implied by the tree, and therefore all the forms of life on Earth. That set of propositions together attempts to explain the origin of new forms of life from simpler pre-existing forms of life on this planet, but it does not attempt to explain the origin of the very first form of life. And that falls to another theory of another branch of evolutionary theory, and that is a branch of evolutionary theory that's sometimes called chemical evolution or evolutionary abiogenesis, the idea that life, and theories of that type attempt to explain the origin of the first life from simpler pre-existing chemicals, non-living chemicals. And so I became interested in the whole question of the origin of life and new forms of life, first by becoming interested in the question addressed by chemical evolutionary theory. Where did the first life come from? And is it plausible to think that it might have arisen by undirected chemical evolutionary processes from simpler non-living chemicals on the early Earth in a so-called prebiotic soup or something, or Darwin spoke about a warm little pond, although he wasn't much interested in the question of the origin of the first life. So that's how I first got into the subject. I became fascinated with the question of the origin of the first life, in particular because I attended a conference where I learned, contrary to everything I had learned in previous biology and chemistry textbooks in college and high school, that leading people working on the question of the origin of life almost universally accepted that we did not have an adequate theory of how life first arose based on evolutionary, based on chemical evolutionary processes.
Yeah, well, that's fascinating. So then as you were studying this, when did you shift into the intelligent design side of this, where there had to be there's an intelligence behind this? And maybe a better way to say that is, you've written 3 pretty famous books on this thing: Signature in the Cell, Darwin's Doubt, Return of the God Hypothesis. There they are. Good. See, we had them already up there before you. And you did these in a specific order, maybe summarizing why you wrote these books and what each entails. That'll actually answer my question and where you got this.
Well,
More fascinating, the last one.
Start by just telling a little bit more about why I got so intrigued with the origin of life problem, because it led naturally to eventually to the books and to my skepticism about neo-Darwinian evolution as well. I attended a conference early in my career. It was I was working, as I said, as a oil company geophysicist, and a conference came to the city where I was working, describing 3 big topics where science and philosophy intersected. And the topics were the origin of the universe, the origin of life, and the origin and nature of human consciousness. And the conference was actually divided up. It had 3 panels on those 3 topics, and each panel was divided in turn between scientists who were staunch scientific materialists or scientific atheists. They were scientists who they may have been agnostic or atheistic in their worldview, but they believed that material processes could explain everything, as opposed to, on the other sides of these panels, people who had a more theistic worldview, who thought that some sort of intelligence or purposive creator had been involved in bringing about the universe and life and our particular cognitive capabilities. And I was, as I said, early in my career, I'd gone to a fairly small liberal arts college that had a religious founding. And so I was maybe a little bit intellectually insecure, thinking that, well, people who believed in God or who were religious or who believed the Bible or things like that probably didn't have much of a leg to stand on in these scientific discussions. What shocked me was that it seemed that in each of the 3 discussions, especially in the discussion about the origin of life, the theistic side of the panel seemed to have the intellectual initiative. And as to the topic of the origin of life, the key thing that nearly everyone agreed about, both the materialists and the theists, was that we didn't have an adequate evolutionary account or explanation for how life first arose. And the reason for that was the discovery of the complexity of the cell generally, which was unknown in Darwin's time, and specifically the informational complexity and properties of the cell. That inside, for example, the DNA molecule or the RNA molecule, that these molecules contained information in a digital or almost alphabetic form that was necessary to build those proteins that your little video was talking about. Mm-hmm. And it was universally accepted by these specialists working in the field of origin of life research or origin of life biology that the chemistry that we have investigated in simulation experiments, trying to show how undirected chemistry might produce the first life, the relevant chemicals, the chemical subunits of these molecules or things that might have made the subunits, didn't want to go in a life-friendly direction. If you just let the chemistry run on its own, it didn't produce things that were going to help you build proteins or DNA or RNA molecules. And so there was a big problem, and it was, how do you get from chemistry essentially to code? And there was no one had a clue. And it turns out that we still don't have a clue about that. That is not at all plausible from the standpoint of what we know about the chemicals that would have been present on the early Earth and what those chemicals will do when they interact with each other without the help of intelligent chemists trying to guide them in a life-friendly direction. And so I got fascinated with this because even though I was not working in any evolutionary-oriented field or even in biology, I was working with, as I said, digital signal processing, which was an early form of information technology. And what fascinated me was the realization that this great philosophical and scientific question, that is, how did life first arise, turned on the question of the origin of information. And as I thought more and more about that, and I studied more about it, I thought that is a really fascinating topic and situation and question, and I wanted to dive more into it. And also, some of the scientists on that panel that I first encountered were already coming to the point of view that information is not the kind of thing that undirected chemical reactions produce. Information in our experience, they argued, is a mind product. It is typically comes from an intelligent cause, not an undirected material process. So some of the scientists that were questioning the chemical evolutionary theory were already starting to turn the corner and think, well, maybe chemical interactions, maybe undirected material processes are not the whole explanation of where life came from, and that maybe instead we're looking at evidence of an intelligent cause. After all, the digital code in DNA has been described by, for example, Bill Gates as something like a computer program, but more complex than any we've ever written. We know that computer programs come from programmers. Maybe that digital code in the DNA also had an intelligent source. And so I was exposed to that idea at this conference and began to investigate it a whole lot more. A year later, I was off to Cambridge to work on the origin of life problem as part of my master's and then my PhD work. And so I've been long interested in the topic. In 2009, many years after I finished my PhD, I finally produced a book on the topic called Signature in the Cell, DNA and the Evidence for Intelligent Design.
Yeah, it's a great book. I think it's the first that I heard about you. One of the things, like when you say stuff like that, the whole chemical to code, and it seems in the basic laws of information, it seems like it's insurmountable. Like there's no argument against that. Why, in your opinion, are so many quote unquote scientists still backing? And maybe they're not. I don't know the latest data. I know a long time ago I heard you on a show and you were talking about some conference they had at the Royal Institute or something where they all met because they knew that model was falling apart. But why are so many people, scientists, school teachers, whatever, still firmly believe in evolution? Is it an evidence thing? Is it a religious thing? What's your thoughts on that?
Well, there again, teasing apart the two branches of evolutionary theory. As for the theory of chemical evolution, there are people who are still doing prebiotic simulation experiments. If you've seen the organic chemist and nanotechnologist James Tour from Rice University on the internet, he has been critiquing these prebiotic simulation experiments as they are being conducted by a few people who remain in that field. It's not a field that attracts a lot of people into it, in part because it doesn't seem that there's much promising going on by way of explaining how you could have gotten life from simpler non-living chemicals in a prebiotic environment. But there are scientists that keep trying to simulate how some of the steps from simple chemicals to life might have taken place under plausible prebiotic chemical conditions.
Okay.
invariably what happens, and Dr. Tour, James Tour, has been very public in critiquing these theories, and he's shown that invariably what happens is that the prebiotic chemists themselves are doing all the important work. They
Right.
choose the
Intelligence. Yeah.
purified reaction, they're called the reagents, the chemicals that you start with. After the first reactions take place, they eliminate using various techniques of organic chemistry. They eliminate the byproducts that they don't want, so they don't interfere with the subsequent reactions. Then, instead of allowing what's left in their test tubes or vesicles to react further, they actually simply identify the thing they want using chemical methods of chemical characterization, and then they go buy that chemical off the shelf and then try to get
Wow.
it to react with something to take on to accomplish the next step in what's called relay synthesis. So at every step of the way, you have intelligent agents intervening into what's going on chemically to move the reactions in a life-friendly direction. And these experiments are called simulation experiments. But that just has led me to ask, well, what's being simulated here?
Yeah.
If what you're showing is that you need intelligent input at every step in the way, you're actually simulating the need for intelligent design to make life. And so I think, and here's the rub, the bottom line is that I think in that field of origin of life research, there are still a few people doing these types of experiments. But I think almost universally, even within evolutionary biology as a general subject, people recognize that we don't have anything like an adequate theory of the origin of life. And so I think that there are still people who say, well, gee, life's on the planet, it must have evolved in some way. But what they reveal when they make that statement is an a priori commitment to some form of materialist evolutionary explanation, even though we don't have evidence that such a materialistic evolutionary process actually took place to produce life. So what they're revealing is a deep a priori commitment to philosophical materialism or philosophical naturalism without any evidence to justify that worldview or what follows from that worldview, which is the need to explain the origin of everything kind of from the bottom up, from the simple particles and energy to a complex cell. And then we can talk separately about biological evolution, and maybe I can tell you a little bit about why I became skeptical of that branch of evolutionary theory.
Well, yes, I love that. Well, they're using intelligence to argue against intelligence, and the other ones are reasoning in a circle. So I'm curious at what point, and this is just maybe a little off topic. At what point did your view of Christianity and your understanding of Scripture come into your life and work together or against or with your understanding of the sciences? Was that early on? Did you become a Christian later, earlier? How did all that kind of merge?
I would say I started to become a Christian late in high school. I had a long, somewhat tortuous conversion experience. It was anything but a Damascus Road aha moment. I am sort of philosophically inclined as well as deeply scientifically interested, but the philosophical side of my temperament, I think, tends to overthink everything. And so it was a sort of protracted affair from late high school. It wasn't really till I had finished high school or finished college, my first year or so, when I had begun working, that I really felt settled in the Christian faith. During my university years, I had become convinced of the truth of Christianity, but I didn't want to believe it, or I didn't want to live it. And so I had a lot of struggles and a lot of wrestling. But there were philosophical arguments for theism that I found extremely persuasive. In particular, arguments about the reliability of the mind, which is the great question that philosophers have been asking since the period of the Enlightenment. On what basis can we trust the reliability of the mind, and therefore trust that human beings can actually know the world as it is, or at least get a close approximation of that? And it turns out that the whole what's called the postmodern turn in philosophy towards skepticism and relativism about knowledge is a consequence of loss of belief in God. Rejection of theistic belief has led to that skepticism. And conversely, I realized that if you believe in God, you have a good reason to trust the reliability of the mind. If a benevolent God not only made our minds, but made the universe to exhibit his rationality, so that we have evidence of design and rationality and lawful order in nature, then the way our minds have been made, then we can trust that the way our minds have been made is in his image, will allow us to know the world as it is. This was a principle that was very important in the founding of the scientific method and the scientific revolution, or the founding of modern science during the period that historians call the scientific revolution. And it was the idea that because our minds are made in the image of the same rational creator who made the world to exhibit a rational order, we are therefore capable of knowing the world as it is. There's a principle of correspondence between the rationality built into us and the rationality that is exhibited in the physical world, in the universe. And so as I realized how much difficulty secular atheistic philosophers were having justifying our ability to know, and yet conversely, there was a ready theological justification for the reliability of the mind, it seemed to me that you kind of had a choice. Either you could believe in science and also then affirm a prior theistic belief, a belief in a benevolent God who made it possible to know the world scientifically, or you could deny the existence of God and then also accept skepticism about our ability to know the world, including skepticism about science itself. So that was a pretty stark choice. I could develop that argument in more detail. I address it a bit in the last chapter of my book, Return to the God Hypothesis. But I once had a conversation with one of the leading atheistic philosophers in the country who asked me about how I had become a Christian. And I told him the importance of this argument from epistemological necessity. And I started to explain it to him. And he said, hey, no need. He said, there's no question, he said, that theism solves a lot of philosophical problems. And so anyway, there were philosophical considerations and arguments like this that played into my becoming convinced in college that theism and indeed Christianity was true. It took me a while, though, to settle and actually to personally want it to be true, and to decide,
Right.
yeah, I want to live this way. And it was in my first year or two out of college that I kind of finally ignited. And then a year or so later, sorry for the long answer to your question.
No, I love it.
I attended this conference and encountered all these scientists talking about these powerful evidences for God from cosmology and astrophysics and from biology and biochemistry, and that's what led me into the work that I'm doing today. So I had philosophical reasons for accepting theism at first, but then I found that there were evidential reasons as well. And so sometimes people talk about whether you're an evidentialist or a presuppositionalist in your approach to what's called Christian apologetics. I'm both. I think both approaches are compelling.
Yeah, I think, okay, I'm going to ask you a question that not many people would probably ask you on other shows because they just wouldn't go there. I mean, evidence is one thing, right? And philosophical understanding is one thing, but there's a point where every human has to repent and be truly converted, and it doesn't come through evidence, or it may get you there. But do you remember the point where you actually acknowledged, or somewhere along the line, look, I need Jesus as a savior?
Well, I'm going to quibble with you a little bit, and then I'm going to answer your question.
Okay.
Because the biblical word repentance is literally the word to rethink. And so a part of a person's conversion is not just a feeling or even a surrendering of one's will to God, which I think is an important part of conversion.
Right.
But it is to rethink, and it's to rethink many things. It's, first of all, to rethink, if you reject the existence of God in your mind, to rethink the evidence pointing in the other direction and to affirm that God actually exists. And the Bible's clear about that too, that it's a necessary condition of conversion to actually believe that God exists.
Yes.
But fortunately, there is evidence for that, and there are things to think about in evaluating that evidence. So that's part of biblical repentance. There's an intellectual and cognitive part of it, and I think too many people have portrayed biblical conversion as just a matter of having a certain feeling, or even believing in spite of what the evidence says. Believing,
Mm-hmm.
as the old Sunday school people used to make fun of Sunday school, saying it was going to learn about, learn things, to believe in things ain't true. And so in a way, when I look back on that period of years from late high school to just after college, I was in a process of conversion. I was all those things I was thinking about, and I remember in my junior year in high school when I was becoming, I was apparently becoming obsessed with all these things, talking to about my friends. My friends at school all thought I was a Christian, but I was, and I remember at one point just telling myself, I have to stop thinking about Christianity for at least 2 weeks. I just have to stop it. And turned out I couldn't. I was, so it seemed, I had prior to that some what I now recognize were deep philosophical questions that I couldn't answer. And as I began to read the Bible, I realized the Bible was speaking to some of those questions. And so maybe that was part of the reason I was so obsessed with thinking about whether or not Christianity was true. But in addition to that, as I began to read, for example, the Gospel of Matthew, which was the first biblical book I actually read, um, I was so compelled, so intrigued, so fascinated, so attracted to the person that was depicted there, the person of Jesus of Nazareth, and now by believers called Jesus Christ. And it seemed to me, and this may have been upon later reflection, I realized there was something about Christ that was so different than every other person. I mean, we had the four Gospels depicting his life, his teachings, his extraordinary encounters with religious and secular authorities, his the healing miracles, the crowds he attracted, the 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 philosophical acumen, the way when confronted with various dilemmas by people who wanted to hang him out to dry, he would time and time again split the horns of those dilemmas, sometimes with incredibly sagacious answers, sage-like answers, and sometimes by putting a question back on, by questioning the questioners in a way that froze them and kept them from being able to prosecute him as a troublemaker in the minds of the people who were listening. Just an extraordinary person. With I remember one of my friends in high school who knew I was kind of brainy and nerdy, told me, "But Steve, Jesus is so intelligent. You have to look at this," because I was having all these
Mm-hmm.
questions. So part of it was simply being attracted to, intrigued with his person. And then I was in Seattle and growing up, and uh, my family were nominally Catholic, and we had left the church 3 or 4 years before, so I didn't know anyone who would have identified themselves as a Christian. I know of a few kids at high school that were really outspoken and also tremendously but just compelling in their personal lives, that they were great examples of Christ followers. So I knew there was something different about them. One particular guy who was a star on our basketball team named Brian Kress, who's I've connected with recently, who's working with one of the ministries that are combating child sex
Trafficking.
slave
Yeah.
trade and stuff. He's living an amazing life. And so I was somebody I looked up to at high school. And so I had a couple role models, or people I respected, who I knew were in some way different in taking the Christian faith very seriously. But I myself didn't know. I wasn't in that. I didn't know basketball stars. I was one of the nerds on the
Yeah.
periphery of the social group in high school. So I learned about, through listening to radio broadcasts on on religious radio stations about prayers that you could pray for salvation, or prayers to ask Christ into your life. And so I did that.
Hmm.
And I kind of maybe was waiting for the clouds to part and lightning bolts or something. And so I probably did it numerous times, and I did do it numerous times. Um, but I also still had simultaneously these philosophical questions about the Bible, questions, some of which I could answer and some of which I couldn't. So it was a long process for me. But I found, I would say, encountering the person of Christ in the pages of Scripture, that there was something, a growing desire in me that wanted to connect with people talked about having a personal relationship with God through Christ. I wanted to have that, and at the same time, I was incredibly frustrated when I heard people talk about that, because I didn't know exactly what they meant. I mean,
Mm.
do you hear voices? What is what what do you does the burning bush pop up in your backyard? What exactly do you mean by that? And so it took me time to sort all those things out. And I know when I was on the Joe Rogan Experience, Joe is well known for his openness to psychedelic experience, and he asked me near the end of the interview if I was open to an enhanced experience of the deity by using mushrooms or something, and I didn't want to discount his experience, and I've actually known a person who's had a powerful experience in that
Right.
way, but I simply said, no, I'm actually pretty happy with my experience of God, and I meant through the Holy Spirit. And it was something
Sure.
I didn't quite understand when I was 17, 18, 19, 20,
Right.
exactly what was involved in the Christian life, and the way in which you begin to recognize that still small voice, or that inner urging that's coming from someplace beyond your own head, to do something, or to pray for someone, or to reach out for someone, or simply to be concerned for someone in a way that in the natural I never was before. So
Right.
so you begin to and it takes time to understand that there is a two-way communication between the believer and God through Christ, and it just takes time to recognize what's involved with all that. So sorry for the long answer.
No, I really
So there was
appreciate that. I'm glad you.
my answer to your question is there was two aspects of it. There was an intellectual cognitive
Sure.
aspect, and there was an opening of my heart and will to um, the presence of God, should He actually be there. I mean, if one more story, sorry, but I'm my senior year in college, I ended up playing on we had a club soccer team at my college, and we played against other clubs. I had no experience playing soccer, but I was reasonably fast, so they put me on the right wing, and we were playing all these teams with foreign players that were very, very good, and we were in a tournament in Walla Walla at another college, Whitman, and I stayed at a friend of mine's home after the tournament, and was really distressed with a lot of things going on in my life, was not yet settled with all these faith questions, and I went out into a wheat field in near Waitsburg, Washington, and shook my fist at God and shouted, "Show yourself to me," probably
Mm.
3 or 4 times. And I was distressed, I was confused, I was angry, I was in some ways convinced that Christianity was true, but I shook my fist at
Mm.
the Lord God Almighty. The next morning we got up early, my friend and another friend, to drive back to Spokane. And on the way back, it was 5 a.m, very early. We were kind of feeling rowdy. We were road tripping. My friend was a cowboy, and his name is Pete Hankey. He's a wonderful guy. He runs a whale watching charter out of Port Townsend today. And we were very close friends, and we had all kinds of crazy adventures together. but he was driving way too fast. And we came up on a turn, and the car, it was a truck, and we just flipped and tumbled several times. I was apparently flying around in the cab. I was not seat belted. And we had another friend with us, and Pete was shouting to her. He said, check Steven, check Steven. We landed first upside down, and then there was enough momentum for the truck to roll one more time. And I was, as it turned out, splayed out across the laps of my two friends. I'd been flying around, but I was pretty much unscathed, except for a couple scars, cuts, light cuts. So we then got out of the truck, walked to the next farmhouse to get help. Pete, we were met at the door by this, and the thing is, what I haven't told is that all my closest circle of friends in college were going through the same kind of things I was, and we were at a Christian college, but none of us were really identifying with faith, and there were, anyway, we got to the door of this farmhouse, and this very sweet Christian lady met us. She found out that we were from Whitworth. She said, "Oh, that's wonderful. God be praised." And she just started talking Christian talk of just the kind of stuff that drove all of us crazy at that point. And Pete had to go call his dad and tell him about the wreck because the cab was just flattened. Mm-hmm. And I sat down while he was making this phone call, and I sat down, and there was a newspaper on the coffee table, and the lady continued to was so sweet to us and so kind, and just assumed that we were devout Christians because we were going to this Christian college. And the newspaper was a sports page, and it had a great big picture on the front page of the sports page, and it was about the soccer tournament that had taken place at Whitworth College over the weekend. And I was still in shock from this experience. And so my eye was gradually settling on the photograph, and it was a picture of an athlete, of a soccer player, and then I realized that it was a picture with a person with a big W on their shirt, an insignia, and it was a Whitworth player. And then I looked at it, and it was a huge color 8.5 by 11 or so picture of me chasing some very skilled, smaller foreign player. Not that that guy was just gassed, but there I was. Yeah. And then suddenly I had this weird kind of recognition and epiphany. As it felt as if someone was communicating with me, and was answering the prayer I had prayed the night before. And I just got shivers. It was like the probability of this was I would never have seen the picture without the wreck. I mean, it just was crazy. And the next month or so, I had a series of actually very dangerous experiences from which I was, in each case, extricated. Spared. And at the end of that, I wrote them all down and then remembered the prayer. And I thought, how could I possibly not think maybe someone heard that? And maybe there was a call.
Show yourself. Maybe you did have a Damascus moment. So there is all those things.
Sorry, I mean it was a lot.
I love that I'm glad you quibbled and went through down that road, because it's really important. We got to switch gears really fast here and wrap up this part of the show.
You can edit any of this out that you want.
I wish, but we're live. So so now we're going to cut right into. I want you to watch. We have a team that goes out and they ask questions, and then we just come back and I want to get your first take on this. This is our team, mic'd up team, going out asking, do you believe in evolution, and get some of these responses. Pretty interesting.
Oh, sorry about that. 1 second. Here we go.
So today we're asking people about evolution.
Okay.
Do you have any thoughts on evolution?
I believe that it's real. I believe that Darwinism is how we came to be here today. So that is what I have to say about it.
So how did you come to that conclusion? Like, what made you believe in Darwinism evolution?
Scientific research, mostly. Papers that I've read online, and really it's the only thing that makes sense. I understand the religious theories and everything, and I'm a religious person myself. I'm a Catholic, but that doesn't mean that science is not real, to be honest. So
So what specifically like really sold it for you about evolution?
I don't know if it was any one thing. It was just mostly like the amount of evidence that was towards evolution rather than against it. There's not a lot disproving evolution.
Could you give me an example of some of that evidence?
I mean, the DNA we share in common with monkeys, and I mean, all the way back, it can take you. Obviously, I'm not well versed in the subject, but I can tell you that I know more about it, more about how to prove it than to disprove it. I can tell you that.
Okay. Well, prove it to me.
I said I know more about it. That doesn't mean I can.
Well, I thought you were saying you know more about proving it than disproving it.
I do, because I can't disprove it at all.
Gotcha.
I can say that I believe in evolution, but that doesn't mean that I can prove it to you. So.
What makes you think it's real?
Just because, like, you know, that little picture of the monkeys, like the climbing up into a human thing, that picture. I don't know, I've never really done a deep dive on it.
So what do you think about evolution being a Christian?
I believe that certain things evolve.
Like what?
I mean, everything kind of evolves, but I don't think that, you know, like we came from monkeys or nothing like that.
So where do you think we came from?
I think we came from test tubes.
Test
Probably
tubes?
that guy's science lab. No, I was just playing. I think that, you know, I believe the Christian story, to sum it up, to kind of make it short. I came from my mama came from her mama, and nobody ever came from monkeys. That's what I believe.
What is the Christian story?
That, you know, that we all come from Jesus, a God, one almighty, all being, all powerful.
Were you taught evolution in school?
Sure, yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on it?
Stand by God. I personally believe the view of Christ and all that, so I believe that God made us what we are.
Do you guys have any opinions on evolution?
Yeah, I believe in evolution, yeah.
Yeah, I believe it's real. I don't have any, like, super strong, like, opinions other than that.
Yeah.
So, like, what are your reasonings for believing it? Like, what led you to believe in it?
All of science pointing towards that being true.
You think all of science points to it being true?
Yeah.
All of mainstream accepted science, yeah.
Yeah, it's the same.
Yeah. So could you, like, give me an example?
Give me an example?
Yeah, of, like, some of the science that proves it.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we have the archaeological evidence of the specific animals that we ourselves are descended from. There's Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Homo sapiens, Neanderthalis, which we're not descended from, but that we are related to. I mean, they look really similar to us, and we can find specific timelines where their fossils become more similar to our fossils, and then anatomically modern humans start appearing. So, to me, that's a very strong evidence, at least pointing towards our evolution.
Yeah. How about you?
Just what they said. Just what they said. They put it best. So
Gotcha.
yeah.
Okay. So have you actually looked at, like, the actual fossils of those?
Have I seen the fossils in
Well, I
person?
mean, like, what they actually found.
Yeah, I've seen some of them.
Yeah.
I've seen fossils of Homo neanderthalis. I've seen fossils of Homo habilis. I've seen fossils of ancient anatomically modern humans, yeah.
Gotcha. How complete were they?
Some complete skeletons, especially for anatomically modern humans. Mostly skulls. For a lot of the older ones, Homo erectus we have a lot of complete skeletons of, which is really great. Homo habilis, I don't know about that. The Homo neanderthalis skeleton that I found was femurs and mostly the skull. The skull is pretty sick.
Gotcha. So are you, like, a strong believer in evolution?
Yeah.
So you think it's a fact?
I think it's a theory.
A theory. So do you think it's possible that something else could be true?
I think it's extremely unlikely.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I believe in intelligent design, so I'm religious. I think that there is a God that created us, and evolution is just the tool that it uses to create and guide everything. Yeah.
Gotcha. So do you consider yourself a Christian?
Yeah,
Gotcha. So how long have you been a Christian?
my whole life.
Awesome. So you grew up in the church?
Yeah, I grew up Catholic.
Gotcha. Are you a Christian or religious at all?
I'm spiritual, but not really. I wouldn't really label myself as Christian.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay. So do you think, like, the Christian view and evolution conflict, or do you think that they actually go together?
It depends on who you ask. I believe, like I said, in intelligent design, I think they go together. I think they're only mutually exclusive if you decide they are. I think the stories in Genesis of the creation of the world You can interpret them literally if you choose to, but the idea of a creation myth and its value as a rhetorical device and thematic devices, other than just a literal story of the creation of the world, is perfectly valid. And that's how I choose to interpret Genesis.
It depends on who you ask, and guess who we're going to ask this question next time? Our guest, Stephen Meyer, is going to answer this and talk a little bit about theistic evolution. I'm going to turn this over to Candace now. I like that guy. The skull was sick, man.
Awesome. Well, we are going to continue this conversation in part 2 in 2 weeks. So come join us again with Dr. Stephen Meyer. And we had some questions come in. I know we had some questions from Michael, from Galix, and a couple compliments. Just thanking you, Dr. Meyer, for coming on and sharing about evolution, but more than that, why you have a relationship with Jesus Christ. And so thank you so much for joining us. Again, join us next time in part 2, and we will see you in a couple weeks.